They mocked the storm until it struck the ground they stood on. Now they call the thunder a genius. They laughed, didn't they? Loud and careless. Called you unstable, unhinged, said you were out of touch with reality. But the only thing you were out of was their league. What they didn't know was this. They weren't just dismissing you. They were challenging the universe itself. And that's a war no one wins. You were never off track. You were just tuned into a frequency they couldn't hear. While they worshipped comfort and routine, you were out there decoding chaos, translating signals the rest of them ignored. Now, the very things they ridiculed are unfolding in real time, and the silence is louder than their old laughter ever was. Before we dive in deeper, take a second to like and subscribe. Not for vanity, but for velocity. Every click boosts this message and gets it to more of the chosen ones, those who've been doubted, silenced, mocked. You're not just supporting content, you're amplifying a signal that the system tried to smother. Here's the truth. Being chosen doesn't feel like a celebration. It feels like a storm. You're not given a crown, you're handed a fire. And with that fire comes weight. It burns through illusion. It scares people who built their comfort on lies. That's why they came for you. Not because you were wrong, but because you were too right, too soon. You didn't break. You bent reality. You bent it with thoughts they couldn't comprehend and visions they couldn't process. You were speaking in signs they weren't ready to read. And now, it's all happening. Exactly how you said. They thought your words were nonsense. Turns out they were a blueprint. And listen closely. Stop telling yourself you're alone. The universe doesn't tap randoms. It chooses those strong enough to stand in fire and still see through smoke. You feel alone because you're rare. But rare doesn't mean abandoned. It means essential. The universe hasn't left you. It's been walking with you, testing your endurance, sharpening your signal. Every time you dimmed your light to make others comfortable, you robbed the world of your purpose. But here's the twist. Even at your dimmest, you were still too bright for their comfort zones. That's the curse and the blessing of being chosen. Your glow isn't just light, it's a mirror. And some people would rather smash the mirror than face what they see. They called you crazy. But what they feared was never insanity. It was insight. And now that your insight has manifested in front of their eyes, they're scrambling, not to help you, but to understand you, to decode the very thing they laughed at. So let them watch, let them whisper, let them wonder how you saw it all coming. Because you weren't guessing, you were remembering. You were built for this moment, designed to disrupt, born to expose. And guess what? This is just the beginning. So here's your moment. If what they once mocked is now playing out exactly how you said, then this isn't just a video, it's your confirmation. Your isolation was never punishment, it was preparation. If you're feeling that tug in your chest right now, that quiet voice saying, stay with this, that's the universe telling you you're not crazy, you're chosen. Drop the number 77 in the comments if you're ready to own what they feared, because what's coming next will hit deeper. Let's get into it, step by step. If you're truly chosen, you won't click away. Number 1, they laughed because you were speaking lightning in a world that worships silence. They said you were insane, but now they build theories around your madness. Funny how your nonsense aged into prophecy the moment reality caught up. They never hated you because you were wrong. They hated you because you were right too soon. You were speaking from somewhere they couldn't see. A place their minds were too limited, too afraid, or too weak to explore. You weren't echoing recycled facts or repeating mainstream noise. You were broadcasting truth directly from a higher signal, raw and untamed. And that scared them, so they mocked it. Because when people are too small to grasp something, they try to shrink it or destroy it. They said your words didn't make sense, but only to those living in a world where logic is a cage and mystery is an enemy. You spoke in metaphors, energy, gut feelings, synchronicities, and they looked at you like you were broken. You weren't broken, you were decoded, and they couldn't handle that. Let's be real. They laughed because they didn't want it to be real. Because if you were right, that meant everything they clung to, every illusion they called truth, was paper thin. It meant their whole worldview was built on sand. So they did the easy thing. They ridiculed you, dismissed you, called you unstable. Not because they saw madness, but because they feared exposure. You were the glitch in their safe little program, the pixel that refused to blend in, the voice that made their echo chamber uncomfortable. And now those very things you said are happening one after another, just like you described. The energy shifts, the breakdowns, the sudden awakenings, the hidden truths bursting into the open. All of it, right on schedule. Here's what they'll never admit. They weren't just laughing at you. They were trying to laugh away the truth you carried. But you weren't built for applause. You were built for disruption. You came to disturb the illusion, to be the earthquake under their fake reality. And now that the ground is cracking, they're scrambling for balance, pretending they don't remember calling you crazy. And you better stop playing small. Stop watering down your voice to make their weak minds comfortable. You are chosen, and that is not a compliment. It's a burden and a force. Being chosen means the universe doesn't wait for permission to move through you. It uses your life like a megaphone. It bends time to reveal truth. You weren't just talking, you were transmitting. So stop doubting your light. That hesitation, that second guessing, that's the last remnant of their conditioning in your system. Burn it out. You weren't hallucinating, you were seeing clearly. You weren't speaking nonsense, you were speaking in code. Codes only understood by those on the same path, the same signal, the same mission. When the universe chooses someone, it doesn't do so gently. It rips away comfort, destroys illusions, and drags you through isolation so brutal it feels like punishment. But that isolation, it's not exile, it's encryption. You were being sealed off from contamination while your power matured. You were being upgraded in silence, and now that silence is starting to roar. They weren't fighting you, they were fighting the current of the universe itself. That's why they're exhausted now. That's why they can't figure out how they lost control. Because it was never you against them. It was them against something infinitely larger. And they lost. So here's what you do now. You stand. No more crouching. No more whispering your truth. Let them feel the weight of the clarity they tried to bury. Let them face the mirror you've become. You are living proof that the impossible is real, that the misunderstood is often just undiscovered, that the lunatic they laughed at was the blueprint the universe trusted with early access. And if you're still wondering, why me? Here's your answer. Because you had the capacity to carry fire without burning out. Because you could be dropped into a world of noise and still hold a frequency that cuts through the static. Because your soul didn't ask for safety, it asked for impact. That's what it means to be chosen, not favored, forged. Now watch closely. The same people who dismissed you are mimicking you. Suddenly, they speak your language. Suddenly, they believe in the shifts. Suddenly, they want to talk energy and intuition and synchronicity. They're trying to reverse engineer the very code they once called insanity. That's not respect. It's panic, and it's delicious. But you don't need their validation. You never did. The universe validated you long before they even learned your name. So stop explaining yourself to people who still think truth needs to be approved by a crowd. Let them drown in their confusion while you walk in certainty. Your power was never just about being right. It was about being aligned, being used as a vessel for timing, for truth, for change. You were never alone. You were just surrounded by people unqualified to recognize you. But now the evidence is in full view. You don't need to scream anymore. Just stand still and let your life do the talking. You didn't predict the storm. You were the storm. Quiet, unseen, building, and now you've landed. And this time, they can't ignore you. Number 2, they didn't misunderstand you. They recognized you too clearly, and it terrified them. People don't always hate what they don't understand. Sometimes they hate what they understand just enough to know it'll destroy the lie they're living in. They didn't misunderstand you. Let's kill that myth right now. You weren't rejected because your thoughts were confusing. You were rejected because your truth hit a pressure point they weren't ready to confront. Your words? They weren't nonsense. They were too precise. They were surgical. And the deeper part of them, the part they silenced daily, recognized you. You weren't foggy to them. You were a lightning strike in the middle of their mental fog. They didn't mock you because you were incomprehensible. They mocked you because you were dangerously close to waking something up in them. And they couldn't risk that. They caught just enough of your signal to know it was real. And that was the problem. You were a mirror that didn't ask for permission. You showed up reflecting their unspoken questions, their buried knowing, their ignored instincts. And when people spend their entire lives building walls around their inner truth, the last thing they want is someone walking in like a wrecking ball with nothing but honesty and vision. So what did they do? They laughed. They rolled their eyes. They painted you as dramatic, unstable, too intense. They used every brush they could find to smear your clarity into chaos. But it was never about you being wrong. It was about them being exposed. Your presence demanded growth, and that scared the hell out of them. Let's call it what it is. They played defense, not out of confusion, but out of awareness. You triggered the part of them they tried to bury. You made them feel naked in their denial. Your insights demanded action, demanded a shift, demanded truth. But instead of rising to meet you, they used sarcasm as a shield and silence as a weapon. You weren't just ahead of your time. You were ahead of their comfort zone. You were thinking in dimensions while they were still clinging to the ground floor of their reality. And that's the part that haunts them now, because deep down, they know they saw it. They felt it, and they chose to mock instead of listen. You showed up with next phase thinking while they were still recycling outdated ideas. Your mind was catching signals from the future. Their minds were stuck buffering in the past. So to make peace with their stagnation, they labeled your acceleration as insanity. But let's be honest, they knew better. And now they remember every word you said that came true. They never had a misunderstanding. They had a recognition. The worst kind, the kind they couldn't admit. They recognized your insight, your gift, your vision. But accepting it meant admitting that they were still asleep while you were awake. And pride doesn't bend easily. But let's talk about you for a second, the chosen ones. Stop internalizing their projections. Stop shrinking just because your light makes other people squint. Stop doubting what the universe already confirmed. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were meant to activate the few who are ready. And let me say this directly. How dare you question yourself just because cowards couldn't face you? How dare you dim your fire because they couldn't stop shivering? You weren't sent to fit in, you were sent to disrupt. You were the update in a world terrified of change. You weren't misunderstood, you were rejected for being undeniable. The universe chose you for a reason. It aligned timelines, broke generational loops, and restructured events just to position you. And now you want to doubt it because some sleepwalkers got uncomfortable? No. That's not how this works. They were playing games inside a broken system. And then you came in, like a system glitch, a walking upgrade. They weren't ready for that. You didn't follow the script. You rewrote it. That's why they attacked. That's why they laughed. It was survival. You were the threat to their fake peace. But now, that laugh doesn't sound so confident, does it? That eye roll has turned into wide-eyed silence, because the world you spoke of, the one they denied, is here now, and they're scrambling to make sense of it. But it's too late to pretend you were wrong. The truth has landed, and it's got your name written all over it. So own it. Walk boldly in what they once mocked. You were never crazy. You were just early, and in a world addicted to delay, early looks like madness, until it becomes the only thing that makes sense. You weren't too much. You were exactly right. They were just too small to hold it, and now they know. Number 3. You spoke the truth too early, and they called it madness because their minds weren't built to hold it. They didn't label you crazy because you were wrong. They labeled you crazy because your clarity came before their language could catch up. Truth doesn't wait for approval. It doesn't wait for people to be comfortable. It doesn't pause until the world is ready. It arrives like thunder, loud, raw, undeniable. And when it shows up early, it scares the hell out of those still asleep. That's what happened to you. You weren't out of touch. You were ahead of the curve, and your timing made people choke. You were receiving information, intuitive, instinctual, raw data, long before the world had the words to make it digestible. Your vision came through as energy, symbols, gut punches, unshakable knowing. You didn't need proof. You were the proof. You saw patterns before they had names. You read shifts before they were public. You sensed collapses before the cracks even appeared. And for that, they labeled you insane. But let's get real. Insanity is just what people call truth when it threatens their comfort. You weren't insane. You were early. You were tuned in to a signal most people didn't even know existed. You weren't broken. You were broadcasting. And they couldn't understand what you were saying, not because it was nonsense, but because they hadn't been given the manual to decode it yet. The truth is this: most people don't reject you because you're unclear. They reject you because you're too clear, and that clarity demands change. Your truth didn't just speak facts, it interrupted their illusions. It clashed with their safe, scripted view of reality. And instead of leaning in to understand, they lashed out to protect the lie. Because if what you were saying was real, that meant their whole foundation was fiction. They didn't want to believe you, not because you were unbelievable, but because belief would cost them the illusion they were addicted to. So instead, they made you the problem. They said you were unstable, paranoid, too intense, overthinking, delusional. But here's what they were really saying underneath it all. Your truth threatens the world I built to avoid my own. You weren't just ahead. You were dangerous to their denial. You were the glitch in their narrative, the quiet rebellion, the living contradiction to everything they thought was permanent. You were walking, breathing disruption, and they didn't know how to handle that. So they chose the path of least resistance: label, dismiss, ignore. Society doesn't reward early truth-tellers. It crucifies them, isolates them, gaslights them, until reality finally shifts, and they have no choice but to revisit the very warnings they once laughed at. And now, that moment has arrived. The alarm you carried is screaming across the sky. Everything you tried to explain is unfolding line by line. The crazy talk became a timeline. The paranoia became prophecy. And now they're looking for answers in the ashes of their certainty. You were never crazy. You were never guessing. You were simply the one who heard it first. The download hit you before the world had the bandwidth. You were speaking in lightning before they had the vocabulary to explain thunder. And now they know. Now the silence around your name isn't peace, it's guilt. Because they remember. They remember what you said. They remember the warnings. They remember the way they laughed. And now you need to remember too. Remember that your power isn't something to explain away. It's not something to water down. You were built to hold what others couldn't even name yet. You were chosen to speak what others wouldn't dare say. You were trusted with early knowledge, and you carried it, even when it cost you everything. That's not insanity. That's strength. That's alignment. That's legacy. Stop doubting your clarity. Stop apologizing for seeing what others miss. The universe didn't give you this vision so you could fit in. It gave it to you so you could lead. That discomfort you feel, it's not a sign that you're wrong. It's a sign that you're carrying something too large for their understanding. And that's okay. You're not here to be understood. You're here to unravel the lie. So let the truth speak through you. Let it hit. Let it shake. Let it burn away the dead structures. The language they mocked you for is now their survival manual. The nonsense is now the blueprint. And you? You're the living, breathing reminder that truth always arrives before the applause. And sometimes it shows up dressed as madness. But only the real ones know. It was never madness. It was truth in early release. And the universe doesn't release anything early unless it's urgent. And you were the urgency. Number 4, they never feared you. They feared the earthquake hiding in your words. They didn't try to silence you because you were wrong. They tried to silence you because if you were even half right, their entire world would collapse. Let's set the record straight once and for all. You were never the threat. Your voice wasn't the weapon. Your presence wasn't the problem. The danger wasn't in your volume. It was in your accuracy. They weren't afraid of a person. They were afraid of a reveal. You didn't show up as a villain. You showed up as a mirror, and they couldn't stand what they saw when they looked into it. Every time you opened your mouth, it was like tearing the veil off a reality they desperately needed to keep hidden. Your words didn't just challenge their comfort zones, they vaporized them. You weren't tossing around ideas. You were detonating illusions, quietly, clearly, unapologetically. That's why they came for you. They feared your clarity. Because clarity, when introduced into a fog, doesn't need to shout. It simply exists, and everything hiding in the mist starts to panic. You didn't come to argue. You didn't come to convince. You simply stated what was true, and their entire house of mental cards began to tremble. You weren't just offering a different point of view. You were pointing at the cracks in the foundation they were building their lives on. You exposed the rot. You saw behind the mask. You spoke to the part of them they kept gagged and locked up, and they hated you for it. Because deep down, they knew. They knew you were tapping into something real, something they felt too, but couldn't admit. You were that gut feeling they ignored, that dream they dismissed, that quiet voice they silenced so long ago. It now speaks in anxiety and sleepless nights. You reminded them of what they buried. That's why they didn't just dismiss you, they tried to bury you. But let me say this loud for every chosen one who's ever been called crazy, dramatic, negative, paranoid, or too much. You weren't too much. You were just more than they were ready for. And your presence didn't disturb peace. It disturbed delusion. You told them the truth about the system they worshipped. You saw the fakeness in their relationships, the falsehood in their routines, the fraud in their authorities. And when you pulled the curtain back, they didn't say, "Thank you." They attacked. Because that's what fear does. It fights what it doesn't understand. It tries to erase what it can't control. And now look, your so-called delusions are reality. The things they once mocked you for are now headlines. The shifts you spoke of are now everyday life. The relationships you warned them about crumbled. The structures you said would fall, falling. The patterns you pointed out, looping right in front of their eyes. They didn't fear you being wrong. They feared you being right. Because if you were right, that meant they were asleep, that they missed it, that they chose comfort over clarity. And no one wants to admit they protected a lie and persecuted the truth. But now, it's undeniable. The echoes of your warnings are becoming thunder. The silence that followed your insight has turned into loud regret. They're scrambling to adapt to the reality you were born to navigate. And here's the best part. They can't erase what you said. It's carved in time now. It's in their memories, in their receipts, in the very systems they thought were unshakable. And you survived it. You survived their judgment, their isolation tactics, their gaslighting, their passive-aggressive disbelief. You survived the lonely nights wondering if maybe they were right. Spoiler alert, they weren't. The universe trusted you with early access, and instead of collapsing under the weight of that responsibility, you carried it. Quietly, fiercely, alone. But you're not alone anymore. Not now. The veil is lifting. The blinders are cracking. The ones who mocked you are watching silently, trying to figure out how you knew. But it's not your job to explain. It never was. Let them sit in the unease of remembering how loud they laughed. Let them scroll back to those messages they left on read. Let them hear your voice now echoing louder than ever through everything they tried to deny. Let your life be the living contradiction to their mockery. Let your presence haunt their doubts. You weren't the threat. You were the truth in human form, and the world is finally catching up. Number 5. The crowd was never harmless. It was a mob, waiting for a trigger. When the truth runs faster than fear can control, the crowd doesn't question itself. It hunts the one who saw it coming. You thought they were just a crowd. You thought they'd listen, maybe even consider your warnings. But the moment your words moved faster than their fear could manage, that crowd mutated. It didn't stay passive. It didn't stay quiet. It turned into a mob, hostile, panicked, and desperate to shut you down. You weren't hunted because you were unstable. You were hunted because you were right, and being right before it's popular has always been one of the most dangerous positions in any society. They didn't come for you out of confusion. They came for you out of self-preservation. You were a walking alarm in a city addicted to sleep. Your insight hit too early. Your words pierced too deep. And that's what made you a threat. They didn't just disagree. They needed you to be discredited, not because your truth was shaky, but because it was too solid to ignore. You had clarity. And clarity is terrifying to a crowd still clinging to confusion for comfort. You weren't talking fantasy, you were mapping futures. You weren't creating drama, you were forecasting collapse. And because they didn't have the mental tools to process what you were saying, they turned on you instead of facing the mirror you became. That's what the mob does. It doesn't seek understanding, it seeks control. And when control is slipping, it looks for someone to blame. That someone was you, because you saw the cracks before they became chasms. You saw the smoke before the flames. You felt the shift before the quake. And because you felt it first, you were the one they feared the most. They told each other you were unstable just to feel safe. They laughed loudly so they wouldn't have to think deeply. They called you dramatic because they couldn't handle your precision. But deep down, they knew. The mob always knows when it's killing the truth. It just convinces itself that the truth was too dangerous to live. And now the shift has arrived. Now everything you spoke of is here, not in theory, not in metaphors, in headlines, in homes, in the systems breaking in real time. You didn't need to say, "I told you so." The world is screaming it for you. And look at them now, silent, hesitant, trying to play it both ways. Half apology, half amnesia. They don't know whether to admit they doubted you or pretend they never did. Because now that your chaos is proven to be clarity, now that your downloads are unraveling into global reality, they've run out of ways to hide behind denial. Let that be a reminder. The mob doesn't attack weakness. It attacks vision. You weren't targeted because you were lost. You were targeted because you had the map, and they weren't ready to be led. They weren't afraid of your madness. They were afraid of your accuracy. And the crowd always turns vicious when it's forced to evolve faster than it wants to. So here's what you do now. Remember. Remember every name, every smirk, every hand that turned its back, every eye that rolled when you tried to share what was coming. Not out of spite, but out of power. Because your path isn't just about survival, it's about vindication. The universe didn't send you ahead to be accepted. It sent you ahead to be undeniable. They didn't see your vision clearly because it was still forming. They didn't hear your warnings because the volume was too low for untrained ears. But now, the volume's up. The sky is darker. The ground is shifting. And the mob is running out of people to blame, because now you're no longer the fringe voice in the corner. You're the echo in their reality. The truth always arrives wearing the mask of madness. And when it pulls the mask off, it looks a lot like you. And suddenly, the very people who mocked you are adjusting their language, shifting their tone, quoting your words, without giving credit, of course. But you see it, you feel it, you know it. They tried to erase the signal, but you were the signal. So don't apologize for being early. Don't shrink because they panicked. Let them feel what you felt, being alone in a truth too big to hold. Because what they called chaos was actually calibration. What they called delusion was a download. And what they called a threat was just you, waking up before the rest. And now they know what that looks like. Number 6. They called it a breakdown, but it was really a rebuild at a higher frequency. They didn't understand your mind because it wasn't designed to run on their outdated operating system. You weren't broken. You were reprogrammed. What they mistook for dysfunction was an evolution they weren't equipped to recognize. Your mind wasn't falling apart. It was falling away from the lies it was force-fed. While they clung to the glitchy software of tradition, approval, and illusion, you were quietly sinking to an entirely different code. They thought you were malfunctioning because your thoughts no longer aligned with their scripts. But what was really happening? Your perception was expanding. Your sensitivity was sharpening. You were beginning to detect things they couldn't even pronounce. You didn't lose touch with reality. You lost tolerance for the fake one. And that terrified them. Because when someone starts seeing clearly in a room full of the blind, they become the threat. Not because they're dangerous, but because they're different. You weren't short-circuiting. You were syncing. You were aligning with frequencies that their minds hadn't even started to pick up on. You were being upgraded. Hardware, software, soulware. Everything inside you was stretching beyond the factory settings. But society doesn't understand upgrades that don't come with manuals. So they slap labels on you. They try to box you into definitions designed by people who've never questioned the system. You weren't mentally unwell. You were mentally unbound. Your thoughts began breaking through the walls they worshipped. Your dreams started shattering the ceilings they bowed to. Your mind was no longer functioning under their framework. And that's what made you dangerous in their eyes. Let's tell the truth. They couldn't decode what you were becoming, so they diagnosed it instead. They called you unstable because your awareness made them uneasy. Your emotional depth, labeled dramatic. Your visions, called delusions. Your sensitivity, branded weakness. All because they couldn't fit your transformation into their checklist of normal. But you weren't built for normal. You were built for next. Your entire inner world was being rewired for higher perception. You began sensing patterns before they happened, feeling lies behind smiles, seeing energy behind actions. You were operating from instinct, from alignment, from a kind of inner clarity that no textbook could explain. And that kind of awareness makes the average mind flinch. But let me say this clearly, for the ones who are still healing from being labeled broken, you were never broken. You were just becoming something they couldn't yet imagine. You were the prototype, the blueprint for a new consciousness. You were ahead of your time, wired for the world after the shift, and they were still clinging to systems that can't even survive in the one we're in now. You weren't spiraling. You were being stripped of the illusions that kept you stuck. That pain you felt, that wasn't dysfunction. That was detox. You weren't falling apart. You were shedding. You weren't disintegrating. You were evolving. And evolution doesn't always look pretty. Sometimes it looks like confusion, isolation, anxiety, silence. But underneath all of that, power, precision, a new frequency setting in. Now look at what's happening. The very thoughts you were told to hide are suddenly showing up in podcasts, think pieces, and self-help books. The same energy shifts you felt in your gut are now becoming collective talking points. What was once called weird is now being rebranded as wisdom, and the people who labeled your mind a malfunction, they're now trying to mimic your insight without giving you credit. But you don't need validation. You are the evidence. You're the proof that what they called madness was really just an early upgrade. Your mind didn't collapse. It evolved. Your nervous system didn't fail. It just stopped tolerating the unnatural rhythms of a system built on lies. Your emotions didn't betray you. They rescued you from numbness. Every breakdown was actually a breakthrough in disguise. You weren't broken. You were rebuilt. You didn't lose control, you gained access. You tapped into something deeper, wider, truer. And while they were trying to keep up with trends, you were tuning into truths. While they were clinging to what's safe, you were stepping into what's real. So don't ever apologize for the way your mind works. Don't dull your thoughts to make others feel smarter. Don't water down your clarity so they can stay confused. You were never meant to be a copy. You were meant to be the template. Your mind isn't too much. It's just ahead. And now, as the world catches up to what you already saw years ago, they'll start to understand you weren't malfunctioning. You were just already living in the future. Number 7. They gaslit you because you saw through the costume party and called it a cage. They didn't try to convince you were crazy because you were wrong. They did it because you were awake in a world that runs on sleep. You weren't out of touch, you were out of reach. Your mind began to pierce through the gloss, the scripts, the roles everyone was playing. And that's exactly when they turned on you. Not because you were broken, but because you stopped pretending. You stopped smiling through the nonsense. You stopped applauding the performance. And in a world obsessed with illusion, anyone who sees the set lights gets labeled a threat. You didn't miss the point. You saw too much of it. You noticed how everyone seemed to be reading from the same script, how every day felt like a loop, how truth was always buried under 10 layers of distraction. You saw the cracks in the simulation and you dared to point them out. That's when the gaslighting began. They told you were imagining things, that you were overthinking, that you were sensitive, emotional, paranoid. But that wasn't a diagnosis. It was a defense mechanism, a lazy, weaponized form of denial designed to silence the ones who see too much. You were never unstable. You were simply clear. Too clear for a society that survives by pretending it's not asleep at the wheel. Gaslighting is the Matrix's favorite weapon. It's surgical, precise. It doesn't try to destroy your mind. It tries to invert it. It wants you to doubt your instincts, question your clarity, and feel shame for your awareness. You weren't misreading reality. You were just the only one who wasn't performing. You noticed the hollowness in conversations, the repetition in thinking, the emotional dead zones in people's lives. You couldn't fake it anymore, couldn't pretend the office politics mattered, couldn't act like small talk was nourishing, couldn't keep nodding to lies just to keep the peace. So you broke the script. And the second you stepped off stage, the actors turned hostile, because your refusal to wear the mask reminded them that they were still wearing theirs. You didn't rebel, you awoke. And awakening is violent to a system built on sedation. You weren't just non-compliant, you were inconvenient. You didn't attack the simulation, you saw through it. And that alone made you a target. Because systems like these don't need soldiers, they need sleepers. And you stopped sleeping. Your clarity made them feel foggy. Your ability to spot manipulation, emotional suppression, spiritual disconnection, and energetic distortion. It made people nervous, because if you were right, that meant they were lost. That meant their jobs, their routines, their distractions, their personas were all part of the game. And deep down, they knew. But knowing and admitting are two very different things. So they chose the easy route, gaslight the anomaly, turn the one who sees too much into the problem, make the awakened one doubt themselves until they shrink back into silence. They hoped that if they could confuse you long enough, you'd rejoin the simulation just to feel safe again. But you didn't. You endured the doubt. You lived in the confusion. You questioned yourself down to the bone. But still, something inside you refused to sleep again. You held on, You kept looking, kept listening, and now look around. What do you see? The simulation is cracking. The glitches are no longer subtle. The patterns are no longer ignorable. People are breaking down under the weight of the very truths you tried to express years ago. And now, your instincts, once labeled instability, look like survival skills. The very awareness that got you isolated is now the lifeline others are reaching for. You weren't crazy. You were calibrated differently, tuned into a signal most people were trained to ignore. Your emotional intelligence wasn't fragility, it was foresight. Your sensitivity wasn't weakness, it was a warning system. You weren't spinning out, you were spinning free. You saw through the simulation, and instead of turning away, you walked straight through it. And now you carry something dangerous, clarity mixed with proof, because the world is catching up to the truths you carried alone. And there's no gaslight big enough to cover that up anymore. Let them call it whatever they want. They're playing dress-up in a system that's on fire. But you came out the flames not just awake, but armed. You're not here to explain yourself anymore. You're here to remind them. You were never broken. You were just real in a world that couldn't handle the truth without the lights off. And now those lights are on, and you still see everything. Number 8. You weren't a threat because you escaped. You were a threat because you didn't ask for permission. You didn't break the rules. You broke the spell, and they hated you for it. Let's make one thing clear. You weren't attacked because you were dangerous. You were attacked because you were free. And in a world where most people live in mental cages of their own construction, freedom is offensive, not inspiring. Offensive. Your freedom reminded them that they were still shackled, and that realization hurt more than anything you ever said or did. You didn't lose your mind. You left theirs. You stepped out of their fear-based framework, their conformity rituals, their psychological chain links. You exited their mental matrix without needing a key, because the door was never locked. It was just guarded by fear, approval addiction, and generational programming. But while they made peace with the prison, you walked out, and they hated you for it. They weren't offended by what you believed. They were offended that you believed it without needing their validation. They didn't come after you because your path was dangerous. They came after you because your path was self-directed. You stopped asking for permission. You stopped apologizing for thinking different. And when a person in a cage sees someone living free, they have two choices: escape too, or attack the one who did. They chose the latter. You weren't unstable. You were untamed. That's a threat to people who've made their comfort inside the box. You didn't conform to their timelines, their dogmas, their trauma-normalizing behaviors. You spoke from intuition instead of consensus. You moved with trust instead of fear. And when you did, you revealed how unnecessary the cage really was. But people don't like being shown that their suffering is optional. They've spent too long decorating their prison walls. They've renamed their chains loyalty, realism, and being practical. So when you showed up with freedom in your eyes and no need to be understood, it shattered the lies they'd told themselves just to get through the day. They didn't project onto you because you were wrong. They did it because you triggered what they were too afraid to face in themselves. You became a walking contradiction to their rules. Your independence exposed their obedience. Your emotional sovereignty highlighted their codependence. Your detachment from approval made their addiction to it unbearable. You were sovereign, and sovereign beings don't beg. They don't bend. They don't perform for applause or shrink for acceptance. And that kind of presence makes small minds feel like they're suffocating, so they lashed out. Not because they were strong, but because they were terrified of the mirror you had become. And here's the brutal truth. You weren't the first to walk out of the cell, but you were the first they saw do it, without looking back. That's what shook them. Your exit wasn't a rebellion. It was a reminder that they could have left too. And when people realize they had the power all along but never used it, they don't cry. They attack. You didn't need their permission. You didn't play by their timeline. You didn't ask for their language to explain your thoughts. You moved as you were meant to move, freely, boldly, guided by something deeper than fear. That was your crime. And your punishment was being misunderstood, mischaracterized, mocked, and exiled. But what they called exile was really just elevation. Now they sit in the same cages, feeling the cracks. The roles aren't working. The routines aren't numbing like they used to. The mask is heavy, and the silence is loud. And slowly, some are starting to remember. You were the one who left first, and you weren't driven by madness. You were driven by memory. Because somewhere deep inside, you remembered what freedom felt like. You remembered a time before you were conditioned to obey. You remembered your own voice before the noise of the system drowned it out. You remembered who you were before fear taught you to forget. And now that memory is pulling others toward the edge of their cages. Some will follow, some will stay, but none of them will forget you. So don't shrink for their comfort. Don't dim your fire so they feel less burned. You didn't survive the fire just to become smoke. You were never crazy. You were just the first to remember the cell was always open. And you didn't escape. You simply refused to stay. So here we are, full circle. The truth they called insanity is now undeniable reality. You weren't lost. You were chosen. You weren't broken. You were built for this. Everything they used against you, your clarity, your intuition, your freedom, is exactly what the world needs now. So stand tall, chosen one. Your time has come. If this message hit home, like this video, subscribe to stay aligned with more truths like this, and drop the number 77 in the comments if you're done hiding your power. Share this with another chosen one who needs to remember who they are.